Family is supposed to be where you are safe, but for me, it became the place that drained me the most. I am Rachel Morgan. 32, the daughter who paid every overdue bill, covered the mortgage, and wrote the checks no one else could. For years I stayed quiet, hoping one day they would see more than the money, that they would finally see me. But in the glow of my sister's engagement dinner, my parents stood before the entire family and told me to apologize or be cast out forever. In that moment, surrounded by whispers and stares, I understood I had never been their daughter, only their provider. That night, a decision began to form inside me, one that would break the illusion of family and expose how fragile their perfect life really was once the money disappeared. The chandeliers in the Cambridge ballroom threw a golden glow across the table, catching the rim of every glass. Emily sat at the center, laughing easily, her diamond ring flashing as she leaned into her fiancé. Relatives crowded around her, voices rising with admiration. I sat 3 seats away, my champagne still full, hands folded neatly in my lap. I reminded myself that tonight was about her, not me. The roast beef on my plate had already cooled untouched when my mother's voice sliced through the noise. Linda rose, glass in hand, her posture stiff. She said I owed Emily an apology, that my words months ago had wounded her deeply. Her tone sharpened as she announced that if I could not apologize, then I would have to accept being excluded from this family forever. My father Charles nodded beside her, his jaw tight, confirming this was no impulsive remark. For a beat, the room froze. Forks hung midair. A cousin cleared his throat and stared at his napkin. My aunt shifted in her chair and whispered ungrateful under her breath, shaking her head. The silence was thick and merciless. Heat rushed to my face as every eye turned toward me. My pulse hammered in my ears. I glanced at Emily. She tilted her head, smirked, then leaned to the cousin beside her and whispered loud enough for 3 people to hear. They laughed quietly, stealing glances at me. The humiliation seared like fire. My glass trembled in my fingers, and I placed it down carefully before it shattered. I wanted to speak, to list every sacrifice I had made, but I bit back the words. This was not the time to remind them of mortgages paid, medical bills covered, tuition balanced on my shoulders. That story would come later. Tonight they wanted my surrender, and I refused to give them the performance they craved. Charles leaned forward, his voice low but steady. Apologize or leave. He set his hand firmly over Emily's, sealing their alliance. Around us, relatives pretended to adjust their silverware or sip wine, but their eyes flicked back to me, waiting. I looked down at my plate, the food untouched, and knew there was nothing left to taste here. I forced myself to sit tall. My chest ached, but I lifted my chin, letting silence answer for me. Emily's smile stretched wider. My mother, as if nothing had been said, raised her glass to resume the evening. She offered a practiced smile, her eyes cold, and the table slowly followed her lead. Conversation restarted in stiff fragments, laughter brittle and thin. The air had shifted. I was no longer part of them, not really. I memorized the moment. The roses in the centerpiece, their sweet scent cloying. The chandelier flickering above, throwing shadows across the table. My uncle whispering to his wife while avoiding my gaze. The shape of my sister's smirk carved into memory. This was the night I stopped pretending. I knew now that the daughter who had carried their burdens would never be celebrated, only tolerated, until she was no longer useful. They had made their verdict public, and I would not bow to it. I sat quietly, steadying my hands, letting the weight of their silence settle. Inside, a decision took root. If they wanted to see life without me, I would show them. If they thought I was only a wallet, they would soon learn what happened when it was closed. What none of them understood was how many years I had already carried their weight, and how close I was to putting it all down. I remember the first time I realized my paycheck was no longer just mine. I was 22, freshly hired at a financial firm in downtown Boston, still learning how to carry myself in heels that pinched my toes. My father had a heart scare that landed him in the hospital. The bills stacked up faster than the nurses could discharge him. $15,000 later, it was my credit card and savings that cleared the balance. I told myself it was what any daughter would do. He promised to pay me back, but the promise faded like the bruise on his arm from the IV line. By the time I was 24, the mortgage on their suburban house in Quincy had slipped behind. Foreclosure notices were coming in the mail. I signed the checks, 20,000 in total, writing my name while my parents avoided my eyes. They said it was temporary, that they just needed a little help until Dad's small electronics shop picked up again. The shop never did. When Emily enrolled in a private college outside the city, I added another 10,000 to the invisible ledger. She called me late one night, her voice sweet and desperate, and I wired the money before asking a single question. I watched her post photos from sorority parties and spring breaks. I never went on smiling as if the world was hers for the taking. She never mentioned the tuition I had covered. Meanwhile, my own dreams shrank into the background. I passed on the chance to pursue an MBA at the University of Chicago, telling myself it was too expensive, too far, too selfish. My friends planned weddings in vineyards, trips to Europe, beach vacations in Florida. I worked late at Beacon Investments, crunching numbers under the glow of fluorescent lights, my dinner, a granola bar eaten at my desk. I poured every raise into someone else's safety net. The night that seared me the most was my college graduation. I stood in my cap and gown, scanning the bleachers for a familiar face. My classmates were smothered in flowers and hugs. My seat stayed empty. Later, my mother explained they could not come because Emily had a regional beauty pageant the same day. She said it as if it were obvious, as if a crown on Emily's head mattered more than the degree in my hands. I smiled when I heard it, but when the lights were off and the cap was tossed in the corner of my room, I sat on the floor and cried until my throat ached. Over the years, I kept quiet. Each time I wrote another check, I told myself it would finally earn me a place in their hearts, that they would see me, not just my money. Instead, the debt between us grew not in numbers, but in silence. I had given them nearly $57,000 in less than a decade, a fortune to me, though they acted as if it was nothing more than my duty. I carried their weight so long that I almost forgot it was not mine. The truth only came back to me in flashes in those moments when my body reminded me how tired I was, when my reflection looked older than 32. And still, at every holiday table, Emily's laughter filled the room, while I sat quiet, careful not to disturb the fragile balance of their love for her. I kept thinking if I stayed patient, something would change. But deep down I knew better. The more I gave, the more invisible I became. And by the time Emily's wedding plans began to unravel, I had already started preparing myself for a decision that would shatter whatever illusion of family I still clung to. The first sign came when Emily showed me a glossy binder filled with photos of her bridesmaids. She flipped through page after page of pastel dresses and smiling faces, and I waited for mine. It never appeared. She laughed, saying she had chosen her best friends from college, the girls who had been with her through everything. I forced a smile, my hands tight in my lap, though I had been with her through far more than any of them. Later that week, I glanced at the seating chart pinned to the kitchen corkboard at my parents' house. My name sat at the very edge of the reception hall, beside the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. My heart sank. That corner was where staff took breaks, where trays of half-eaten food would pass by all night. I stared at the neat handwriting, wondering if it was a mistake. When I asked, my mother barely looked up from her coffee. Linda told me it was better this way. She said Emily deserved to shine, and I should know my place. Her voice was calm, almost casual, but the words landed like a slap. I opened my mouth to argue, then stopped. What good would it do to remind her of the years I had made sure Emily had a place to sleep, tuition to pay, clothes to wear? None of it mattered now. Emily walked in just as the silence between us stretched. She glanced at the chart, then at me, and shrugged. She said the wedding was hers, not mine, and that it had nothing to do with me. She said it with such ease, as though I were nothing more than a distant relative who had wandered in by mistake. I felt my throat tighten, and heat rush to my face. That night I lay awake replaying the conversation. The casual cruelty in Emily's voice, the indifference in my mother's eyes, the way no one had even considered me for a role in the bridal party. I had not expected to be maid of honor, but to be erased entirely was another wound altogether. At work the next day, my mind wandered. Spreadsheets' blurred numbers dissolved into memories of being 12 years old, giving Emily the last cookie, because my mother told me to be the bigger sister. I remembered standing quietly, while she wore the dress I had wanted for prom, my mother insisting it looked better on her. That pattern had not just survived, it had calcified. And here it was again, dressed up in pastel colors and wedding flowers. A week later, during another family dinner, Linda made her expectations plain. She said I should sit quietly and let Emily have her moment. She told me not to draw attention, not to make the day about myself. The words twisted in my stomach. I realized she saw me not as a daughter, but as insurance, someone who existed to pay bills and stay silent. I watched Emily that evening, the way she tossed her hair, the way everyone leaned toward her stories. I thought about all the deposits I had already made for her wedding, $12,000 that had vanished from my account without a thank you. I stared at my glass, the ice melting slowly, and wondered how long I could keep swallowing the bitterness. Walking out into the cool night air, I knew something inside me was shifting. I could not sit by the kitchen doors smiling politely while strangers enjoyed the wedding I had paid for. I could not keep letting them assign me the role of invisible benefactor. My silence had bought me nothing but contempt. I stood in the driveway looking at the house where I had grown up, where every wall still held the echo of me giving way to someone else. My breath came in sharp bursts as the truth settled in. They had never seen me as a daughter to be celebrated, only as a wallet dressed in flesh and bone. And once that realization took hold, I knew a reckoning was coming, one they would never see until it was far too late. The following week, I scheduled an appointment with David Carter, a family attorney, whose office overlooked the Charles River. I sat in the waiting room clutching a folder filled with statements, checks, and receipts, the paper trail of my quiet sacrifices. When he called me and his handshake was firm, his expression kind but professional. I told him everything from the hospital bills to the mortgage payments, from Emily's tuition to the wedding deposits that carried my name. My voice shook when I admitted I wanted to stop, that I needed to know if there would be consequences. David listened without interrupting, tapping his pen against a yellow pad. When I finally stopped, he said the words that released the knot in my chest. None of those payments were legally binding obligations. They were gifts, voluntary support. I had every right to stop tomorrow, and there would be no case against me. I sat back stunned by how simple it sounded when framed in legal terms. He told me I had to protect myself, that even family could exploit good intentions until nothing was left. That night, I opened my laptop at the kitchen table and began dismantling the system I had built around them. I logged into the bank's portal and canceled the automatic transfers that had been quietly draining my account every month. I called the credit card company and revoked the authorized user privileges my parents had enjoyed for years. My hands trembled slightly as I signed the documents to rescind the power of attorney I had once given my mother when she convinced me it was convenient for emergencies. I typed a series of emails to vendors terminating contracts for Emily's wedding. The deposits were in my name, my signature, and each message closed another door they had walked through without hesitation. As I clicked send, I felt both grief and relief. Grief for the years I had tried to earn love through dollars, relief for the first taste of freedom. I closed the laptop, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, and realized the weight on my shoulders had shifted. Within a week, the ripple hit their house. Charles opened a bank statement and saw the sudden gap in funds. He accused Linda of hiding money. She denied it, her voice rising in the kitchen, until Emily stormed in demanding to know what was going on. The argument spilled over dishes, clattering, doors slamming. What had once been a calm household began to fracture, hairline cracks spreading across every room. I did not have to be there to witness it. Cousin Lisa called me one evening, her voice low, telling me she had stopped by and heard them fighting. Charles shouted about mortgage payments. Linda snapped about bills she had covered. Emily cried about her ruined seating chart. Lisa said it was chaos. I pressed the phone to my ear and closed my eyes, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and vindication. At work, I found myself smiling without realizing it. For the first time, I was paying only my own bills, planning my own future. Yet in quiet moments, guilt whispered at the edges. I wondered if I had abandoned them. But then I remembered my mother's voice at the table, cold and final, telling me to know my place. That memory stiffened my resolve. One night as I walked home along Commonwealth Avenue, the lamps glowing against the frozen sidewalks, I realized something had shifted permanently. I had chosen myself over them. The freedom was intoxicating, but I also knew it was only the beginning. Families like mine did not collapse quietly. They would fight, they would blame, and in their eyes, the villain would always be me. What I did not yet know was how quickly those cracks inside their house would deepen, and how soon the world outside would begin to notice. By early spring, whispers started to circle through the neighborhood. Pastor John, who rarely involved himself in family matters, mentioned to one of my cousins after Sunday service that the Morgans seemed to be in trouble. He had heard the bank was preparing action on the house in Quincy. Within days, the news traveled across pews and dinner tables, and soon everyone in town knew my parents were behind on their mortgage. I received confirmation in the mail forwarded accidentally to my apartment, a crisp envelope marked with the words, "Notice of Default." I stared at it knowing exactly what it meant. The house I had kept afloat for years was now sliding toward foreclosure. My phone buzzed that evening with a call from Cousin Lisa. She spoke in a hushed voice, telling me she had dropped off groceries at the house and found my parents sleeping in separate rooms. The tension was so thick, she felt like she had walked into a war zone. Charles had accused Linda of hiding money. Linda had screamed back that he had no idea how much she had covered. Emily had fled to her room, slamming the door while dishes clattered in the kitchen. Lisa said she left quickly, but the image of two people who once hosted every holiday, now barely speaking, had shaken her. I listened in silence, the phone pressed against my cheek. A part of me felt the ache of loss, but another part felt something colder, a strange calm. I had seen this coming. Years of leaning on me had hollowed them out, and without my help, the walls were finally collapsing. Days later, my phone lit up with a message from my mother. The words were sharp typed in all capitals, as if volume could mask desperation. She said I had destroyed the family, that by pulling away, I had betrayed them in front of the entire community. I read the message twice, waiting for the familiar sting of guilt. Instead, I felt an odd stillness. For the first time, I understood that her anger was not about me. It was about losing the control she had always held. At work, I caught myself smiling faintly, though the truth carried its own weight. I walked past Beacon Street on my lunch break, watching families gather in cafes, mothers and daughters laughing easily, and wondered if I would ever know that kind of bond. My own family was unraveling like thread pulled too tight, and my absence had only revealed how fragile it truly was. Lisa called again the next week. She told me Charles and Linda had stopped attending church together. He sat on one side of the pews, she on the other. Emily tried to mask her embarrassment, but even her friends had begun to whisper. The Morgans, once the model of stability, had become the subject of gossip. I thanked Lisa for telling me, though I could hear the discomfort in her voice. That night I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the glow of the city through my window. My phone sat on the table, the last text from my mother still visible. I knew I could reply, that I could try to soothe the fire, but I did not move. I realized her words no longer carried the same power. For years I had feared her disappointment, but now I saw it for what it was, a shield for her own failures. The quiet in my apartment felt heavier than usual, but it was mine. And even as I sat there, heart steady, I could sense the storm inside their house was only beginning. The fractures were widening, and soon they would break open for everyone to see. It started with a phone call from Emily, her voice shrill and panicked. The venue had demanded immediate payment, or they would cancel her reservation. She cried that the deposits had vanished, the florist had pulled out, and the caterer refused to hold her date any longer. I sat at my desk, listening, the city humming outside my apartment window. and realized her fantasy wedding was collapsing piece by piece. 2 days later, I drove past my parents' house and saw Emily on the front steps, her mascara streaked across her cheeks. She shouted into her phone, pacing in the yard, while Linda hovered behind her, wringing her hands. When she saw me, Emily snapped the call shut and glared as if I had orchestrated the ruin personally. She demanded to know if I had canceled everything. I simply told her the contracts were in my name, and I had ended what I could no longer afford. That weekend, Kyle Anderson appeared. I had not seen him in years, but there he was, standing in the driveway holding papers in his hand. He was 30 now, heavier in the shoulders, his jaw tight with anger. He told Emily she owed him thousands, that she had borrowed money last year when planning her engagement parties. He waved the signed IOU in front of my parents, his voice rising as he threatened to take her to small claims court. Emily burst into tears, clutching her mother's arm, insisting it was a misunderstanding. Linda turned to me as if I were the solution. Her eyes were wide, desperate, the same eyes that had once convinced me to swipe my card again and again. She whispered fiercely that I had to help, that I could not let our family be humiliated in front of the neighbors. She begged me to pay to cover the debt to save Emily's wedding. I looked at her steady, this time my voice clear. I told her she had made her choice. I reminded her that she had stood in front of our relatives and told me to know my place. Now I had. I said it was not my responsibility to rescue them again. The words landed heavy in the air, and for once she had no answer. Emily collapsed onto the steps, sobbing uncontrollably, while Kyle shoved the papers back into his folder and muttered that he would see her in court. Charles came out of the house, then his face red, demanding to know what the commotion was. When he learned the truth, his voice thundered through the yard, blaming Linda for indulging Emily and Linda firing back that Charles had never provided enough. The neighbors peeked from behind curtains as the shouting grew. I stood quietly at the edge of the driveway, feeling something unfamiliar rise inside me. It was not pity, nor was it guilt. It was strength. For the first time I had said no, and meant it. My mother's pleas slid off me like rain against glass. The power she had held for so long was gone, and she knew it. I walked back to my car while their voices clashed behind me, Emily's cries mixing with the sharp tones of my parents. I gripped the steering wheel and let out a breath I had been holding for years. The weight of their needs no longer pressed down on me. I had finally drawn the line, and it would not be crossed again. What I could not ignore, though, was the sound of their chaos echoing down the block, a sign that the collapse inside their home was no longer private. And soon, the entire community would see it with their own eyes. It was a crisp October evening when the shouting started. The windows of the Quincy house were open, and the words carried down the street. Charles's voice roared, accusing Linda of leaning on me for too long, his anger echoing off the clapboard walls. He demanded to know if she was satisfied now that I was gone. Linda's voice rose sharper, cutting through the night. She screamed that if he had been a real provider, she would never have needed to beg me for help. Neighbors stepped onto porches, their arms crossed against the chill, as the argument spilled into the yard. The Morgans had always been the family who hosted barbecues and block parties. Now their dirty laundry was broadcast under the glow of street lamps. A boy on his bike froze at the curb, wide-eyed, as Linda hurled words that could not be taken back. Someone finally called the homeowners association. A representative arrived, shifting uncomfortably as he reminded them that noise violations would not be tolerated. But the voices did not soften. Charles shouted about hidden credit card bills. Linda fired back about overdue mortgage payments. Emily burst through the door, mascara streaking down her face, begging them to stop. Her cries only seemed to add fuel. Across the street, curtains twitched and lights clicked on one by one. The fight that had been private for years was now a spectacle. By Sunday, Pastor John had heard every detail. Whispers spread across pews at church and through coffee shops downtown. People who once envied the Morgan family now shook their heads. They murmured about mounting debt, about a daughter who had been spoiled beyond reason, about the older sister who had finally stepped away. The perfect image had cracked, and everyone was watching it shatter. The breaking point came when Charles dragged a battered suitcase down the steps. His hands were clenched so tightly the veins stood out on his arms. Linda clung to his sleeve, sobbing, begging him to stay, but he shook her off. He marched to his car, threw the suitcase inside, and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, and he drove away without looking back. Linda collapsed on the porch, her cries echoing into the night. Neighbors whispered, some shaken, others, almost satisfied to see the truth laid bare. The image of my mother kneeling on those steps traveled faster than gossip ever had. Within days, the whole neighborhood knew that the Morgan marriage had fallen apart. The couple who had once presented themselves as untouchable had disintegrated under the weight of their own secrets. I heard it all from Lisa. Her voice was heavy as she described Aunt Linda's face twisted with grief, her hands clutching the porch railing. She said Uncle Charles had checked into a cheap motel off Route 3 and refused to take Linda's calls. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear, my stomach tight. A dozen emotions swirled inside me, pity among them. But stronger than pity was the sense that a verdict had been delivered. For years I had borne the blame in silence, hoping for recognition that never came. Now their collapse was public, undeniable, and I was not the one carrying the shame. Justice had not arrived in a courtroom, but in the echoes of their own voices carried out into the cold autumn air. And yet, even as I listened to Lisa, I knew the fallout was not finished. The storm that tore through their marriage was only the beginning, and the ruin that followed would reach farther than anyone expected. I signed the lease for a small apartment in Back Bay just before Christmas. The building was old brick with tall windows that looked out over the Charles River. When I turned the key for the first time, I felt something I had never felt in my parents' house, a sense of space that was mine alone. I unpacked slowly, setting each book on the shelf, hanging a single framed photograph of myself at college graduation, the picture no one else had shown up to witness. That first week, I walked the river every evening after work, the cold air biting my cheeks, the city glowing across the water. Each step felt like reclaiming something I had been forced to give away. I was 33 starting over, and for the first time I felt free. Karen White, a friend from college who now taught at a nearby school, invited me to a support group she attended on Wednesday nights. I hesitated, then went. We sat in a circle in the basement of a church, drinking bad coffee from styrofoam cups, sharing pieces of ourselves. I told them about the weight I had carried for years, about the ultimatum at the engagement party, about the silence that followed every sacrifice. When I finished, Karen reached across and squeezed my hand. I realized I was not as alone as my parents had always made me feel. Meanwhile, the news from Quincy grew darker. The bank foreclosed on the house that spring. The lawn went brown. The windows bore the family name removed from the mailbox. Neighbors whispered as movers hauled out the last of the furniture. Emily's wedding never happened. Vendors sued for unpaid balances, and Kyle took her to court over the IOU. She moved in with a friend across town, her social media a parade of smiles that fooled no one. Charles and Linda separated quietly after the night of the suitcase. He stayed in a rented room off Route 3, and she shuffled between relatives, her pride gone, her bitterness louder than ever. For years, they had told me that without family, I would be nothing. Yet now, I was the one building a life, and they were the ones left empty-handed. One Sunday afternoon, I walked home from the support group's sunlight, slanting over the frozen river. I thought about the words my mother had thrown at me, that I would end up alone if I did not obey. I whispered them to myself, and then I smiled. Because I was not alone. I had friends who saw me a career I had built without their help, and a peace I had never known under their roof. They had lost their home, their marriage, their illusions. I had lost nothing worth keeping. As I stood on the bridge watching the water flow beneath, I felt the quiet certainty that justice had arrived. It had not come through revenge or spectacle, but through the simple act of walking away. They once said I would be nothing without them. But when I stepped out of their shadow, it was their world that collapsed. If you have ever felt pressured or dismissed by family, I hope my story reminds you that choosing yourself is not betrayal. It is survival. Share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you have faced moments like this, and stay connected here for more stories of truth, justice, and the strength it takes to walk away.